Donald Trump, the front runner, would you say, with the two-man candidates behind him, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley?
Yeah, I would say that it would be shocking if President Trump didn't win the Iowa caucuses at this point. The real question is whether or not Nikki Haley is going to be able to bypass Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for second place. DeSantis has gone into this presidential election putting a lot of emphasis on its ability to rally evangelical voters in Iowa. And if he winds up coming in third behind the former South Carolina Governor Haley, that's essentially going to be the death knell of his campaign.
And what about the Democratic caucuses that will be happening soon after the Republican caucus? What do we need to be looking out for with that?
I don't think that the Democratic caucuses are seen at all as competitive. They usually aren't when there is an incumbent and president. And the candidate that we did see performing strongest in the Democratic primary against President Biden, John F. Kennedy Jr., wound up dropping out of the Democratic primary because he saw no avenue or no path for victory in the primary races. So I think the Democrats are more or less locked in at this point to go with President Biden for a second round.
All right, we're seeing at the moment in Washington, D.C., a protest, thousands marching today to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, and it comes after Secretary of State Antony Blinken's fourth visit to the region. We're expecting up to around 25,000 people there, I believe. What are your thoughts on this? Again, we're seeing conflict in the Middle East. We've seen Blinken's fourth visit there and Joe Biden's response as well to Iran. What do you think the latest is, and what do we need to know?
From the perspective of American politics, this is a particularly divisive issue for Democrats. The Republicans are more or less lockstep behind Israel on this matter, but the Democrats are deeply divided because they're a more diverse coalition to begin with. Historically, at least since the year 2001, most American Jews and most American Muslims have been Democrats. You also tend to see Democrats performing stronger among African Americans and Latinos. And a lot of the parts of the Democratic base identify with the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. At the same time, there has been strong historical support for Israel in the Democratic caucus. And a number of American Jews do put support for Israel as an important part of the reason why they support the Democratic Party. So this is an ongoing issue that's creating considerable tension within President Biden's electoral caucus. And we can see that in his approval numbers. We see President Biden significantly below his level of support that he had in 2020 among voters under 30, where we see sympathy for the Palestinian plight strongest, and among African Americans.
This year is going to be a big one for elections worldwide. Close to half of the world's eligible voters, or around 2.8 billion people, are going to be heading to the ballots. Huge political and geopolitical impacts here. Of course, Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, has won Taiwan's presidential election, representing the DPP for a third straight term. It's certainly drawn global attention. How do you think, from a political angle, this is going to be, and how do you think, in terms of the economics and the world responding, we will be watching for?
Well, I think overall, the Americans are going to be happy with a DPP win. They ran, as I understand it, on diversifying their economy and moving more of their trade away from China. If that's moving it more towards countries allied to the U.S., like Australia, like to Japan, I think the Americans are going to be happy with that development. At the same time, they do not want to see a East Asian conflict erupting, especially when there are so many other flashpoints across the world. So I think that they're also going to want to be cautious about how they approach this election, and in particular, keep a careful eye on how the Chinese government chooses to interpret this re-election.
Certainly, as we know, Taiwan, the world relies on semiconductors, for example, which is 90% of most of the advanced semiconductors that we use across the globe. We saw the impact through COVID. That's just one of the main things, of course, we'll be looking out for as we move forward. And US Secretary of State Antony Blinken raised concerns over China's human rights issues in a meeting with senior Chinese official, and that was in Washington. What do you think the outcome of Blinken's comments were there? And again, what do we need to be mindful of?
The Biden administration has been fairly consistently raising the concerns about the Chinese human rights records, particularly in Xinjiang, pretty much since they took office in 2021. So I think that this, in a way, kind of puts them back on notice that the Americans are still paying attention and still holding that as an important issue. But I don't think it represents an unusual development in the American-Chinese bilateral relations.
We have a little bit more time left, so let's get back to the Iowa caucus. And what are your thoughts on Donald Trump potentially winning the 2024 presidential election?
Anyone who wins a major party nomination has a fairly good shot at winning the presidential election overall. We've seen that ever since the 2000 elections in particular, but even going back into the 90s and even maybe the 70s and 60s before that, American elections over the last half century have become increasingly competitive, with only a few key states deciding the outcome of that election. So regardless of the size of the overall popular vote, because of the tightness of the Electoral College in states like Wisconsin, in states like Michigan, and in Pennsylvania, as well as in Arizona and Nevada, any person getting a Republican nominee is going to have more or less a 50-50 shot at winning the election. Now, going with President Trump, he's coming with a particular set of baggage. He's facing multiple indictments across multiple different court trials. And that is something that voters are uncomfortable with, although that is something that has also seemed to have rallied support for him within the Republican Party itself. So overall, I'd say that I would give him maybe a 40% chance at this point of winning the presidential election. But we're going to have to see. Most Americans aren't going to really start tuning into the presidential election until August of next year.
All right. Well, we look forward
this
to.
Year.
Yeah, I know. It's moving fast, isn't it? 2024, we are here. Thank you so much for your time and expertise. Great to see you. Thank you.
Yeah.